Inmates could be placed in solitary not just for violence or escape attempts, but for suspected gang membership. If an inmate had certain tattoos, received letters from suspected gang members, or even drew symbols in their notebooks, prison investigators could validate them as affiliated with groups like the Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, or Black Guerrilla Family. Once validated, they were sent to the SHU, indefinitely. No trial. No end date. No path out except debriefing, snitching on others. Many refused, fearing retaliation. Some agreed and later disappeared into protective custody. For those who stayed silent, isolation became a life sentence within a life sentence. As one former inmate put it, in the SHU time doesn't move. It just folds in on itself. Over the years, lawsuits began stacking up. Families, journalists, and human rights advocates started to document what life was really like inside those concrete walls. What they found would shock even the most hardened observers. Because at Pelican Bay, survival wasn't just about staying alive, it was about staying sane. Inside Pelican Bay's SHU, the battle isn't fought with fists or weapons, it's fought in the mind. The walls don't just hold prisoners, they start to consume them. Psychologists who studied long-term solitary confinement describe a pattern, a slow unraveling of the human psyche. The first few weeks, inmates are restless, pacing the 8x10 cell trying to keep their minds occupied. After months, that restlessness turns into withdrawal. The silence grows heavy. Time loses shape. In Pelican Bay, isolation becomes a kind of psychological erosion. Without sunlight, human touch, or conversation, even the strongest minds begin to fracture. Many inmates start talking to themselves, not out of madness but survival. One former SHU prisoner described it this way: you start creating your own world. Because the real one is gone. The human mind versus concrete walls. Studies later confirmed what many prisoners had long said, that solitary confinement causes measurable brain changes. Electroencephalogram (EEG) scans from inmates who had spent years in isolation showed lower activity in parts of the brain responsible for emotional regulation and decision-making. In plain terms, the brain begins to shut down from lack of stimulation. Dr. Craig Haney, a psychologist who studied Pelican Bay inmates, testified that prolonged solitary confinement can lead to what he called social death. He described men who couldn't look others in the eye anymore, who twitched at sudden noises, who forgot how to talk in full sentences. One inmate, after 15 years in the SHU, told researchers, "I forgot the sound of my mother's voice. I'd dream about her, but when I woke up, I couldn't remember what she sounded like. That's when I realized I was losing my mind." This wasn't a rare story. Letters smuggled out of Pelican Bay described hallucinations, paranoia, and a haunting sense that the mind itself was deteriorating. Men saw shadows moving on the walls. They heard voices whispering through the vents. Some began to believe the prison was controlling their thoughts, that the lights, the air, even the food were tools of psychological warfare. To the outside world, these claims sounded delusional. But inside Pelican Bay they were routine. The quiet experiments of desperation. The deprivation was so total that prisoners invented ways to feel alive again. Some turned their tiny cells into gyms, working out obsessively, 1,000 push-ups, 500 squats, 1,000 sit-ups a day. Others memorized books, replaying each word in their heads until they could recite entire chapters from memory. One man carved chess pieces out of soap. Another built imaginary friendships with the ants that crawled through cracks in the wall. But not everyone survived the mental strain. Suicides in solitary confinement units were disproportionately high, several times greater than in the general prison population. At Pelican Bay, suicides were often silent. An inmate would simply stop responding. No noise, no struggle. By the time officers noticed, it was too late. According to California Department of Corrections data, at one point nearly half of all suicides in the state's prisons occurred in isolation units like the SHU, even though they housed less than 10% of the total prison population. Madrid versus Gomez, 1995. The court steps in. The psychological toll finally reached the courts in 1995. A federal lawsuit, Madrid versus Gomez, exposed the reality of Pelican Bay's operations. The judge, Thelton Henderson, visited the prison himself. What he saw shocked him. His ruling declared that Pelican Bay's SHU conditions violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment, especially for mentally ill prisoners. Judge Henderson wrote, "The conditions at Pelican Bay may press the outer bounds of what most humans can psychologically tolerate." While he stopped short of calling all solitary confinement unconstitutional, he ordered major reforms, improved mental health services, more oversight, and an end to placing mentally ill inmates in total isolation. But change came slowly. Prison officials defended the SHU as necessary for safety and control. They argued that without it, violence would spiral. To the public, the issue seemed abstract. But for the men inside, each day still felt like a slow-motion breakdown. The sound of madness. Inmates often said that Pelican Bay had a sound. It wasn't the clanging of metal, it was the silence. A silence so deep that you could hear your own heartbeat echoing against the concrete. That silence drives men inward. Every memory becomes louder. Every regret sharper. Some begin reliving crimes, conversations, mistakes, over and over again. The mind loops endlessly because there's nothing else to hold on to. One man wrote, "After years in the SHU, your dreams start to feel more real than your life." Others began harming themselves, not out of hopelessness but to feel something. A cut, a bruise, a drop of blood was proof they were still alive. The irony of control. Pelican Bay's SHU was supposed to create order. But isolation didn't stop gang activity, it transformed it. Inmates began running criminal networks through coded letters, hidden notes, and messages sent through visiting rooms. Control bred adaptation. The human mind, even in captivity, finds ways to resist. By the early 2000s, California faced growing pressure, from activists, lawyers, and even former guards, to reform or shut down the SHU. The question wasn't whether Pelican Bay could control its prisoners. The question was whether the system itself was losing its humanity. And for those trapped behind its gray walls, the war for their minds never really ended. For more than 2 decades, the world outside barely knew what life inside Pelican Bay's SHU really looked like. It was a place deliberately hidden, out of sight, out of mind, and surrounded by miles of fog, forest, and razor wire. But by 2011, that silence shattered. From behind the thick concrete of the security housing unit, hundreds of men began to fight back, not with violence but with their bodies. The birth of the hunger strikes. In July 2011, prisoners inside the SHU launched a hunger strike that would become one of the most significant acts of resistance in U.S. prison history. It started with 11 men, inmates from rival gangs including the Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, Nuestra Familia, and the Mexican Mafia. Groups that had been enemies for decades were now united by a single cause, ending indefinite solitary confinement. They called it the Agreement to End Hostilities. It was unprecedented, a truce forged inside one of the most violent prisons in America, born from shared suffering. Soon, over 6,000 inmates across California joined the strike. They refused food, risking organ failure and death, to demand change. Their demands were simple, almost painfully human. An end to indefinite isolation. Access to educational and self-help programs. Better food and medical care. The right to contact visits and sunlight. And fair criteria for releasing inmates from the SHU. But for prison officials, those demands were an attack on the very foundation of control. At first, they downplayed the protest, calling it manipulation by gang leaders. Yet, as the strike spread statewide and news outlets like the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and CBS News began reporting, the world finally looked toward Crescent City. Inside the strike. Inside Pelican Bay, hunger meant pain. By the second week, inmates were collapsing from dizziness and dehydration. Medical staff began weighing prisoners daily, recording blood pressure and heart rates. Some men lost up to 20 pounds in 2 weeks. Others developed kidney failure. One prisoner wrote in a smuggled letter, "Every time my stomach cramps, I remind myself, this is what freedom feels like." Outside, families and advocates rallied in solidarity. Mothers, wives, and children stood on the courthouse steps in Sacramento holding signs that read, "Stop the torture," and "We are their voice." The hunger strike resumed again in 2013, this time even larger, with 30,000 prisoners participating across California. It became one of the largest coordinated prison protests in U.S. history. The government responds. California's Department of Corrections faced mounting pressure. Federal judges ordered reviews of SHU policies, journalists published exposés, and the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture condemned long-term solitary confinement as a form of psychological torture. But Pelican Bay officials stood firm, insisting the SHU was essential for controlling gang violence. They claimed the hunger strikes were orchestrated by gang shot callers trying to regain influence. Still, the protests worked. By 2015, the state of California finally agreed to a landmark legal settlement, Ashker versus Brown. Named after inmate Todd Ashker, one of the original hunger strike leaders, The lawsuit fundamentally changed how the SHU operated. Under the settlement, California agreed to end indefinite solitary confinement, review every SHU case statewide, transfer long-term isolated prisoners into general population units if they had no recent serious violations, restrict SHU terms to a maximum of 5 years unless new evidence justified continued isolation. It was a monumental shift, not just for Pelican Bay but for prison systems across the country. For the first time in decades, hundreds of men stepped out of the SHU. Many blinked against real sunlight for the first time in 10, 15, even 20 years. The faces of resistance. Todd Ashker wasn't a household name, but in prison reform circles he became a symbol. Convicted of attempted murder in 1987, Ashker had spent more than 25 years in isolation at Pelican Bay. In a rare statement he wrote, "Our resistance was never about violence. It was about dignity. We refused to be broken." Others like Sitawa Nantambu Jama, a former black guerrilla family member, spoke about building unity across racial and gang lines, something few believed possible inside California's divided prisons. He said, "We realized the system was playing us against each other, so we made peace and that peace became power." These men became unlikely revolutionaries, organizing with nothing but handwritten letters, coded notes and word-of-mouth communication through vents and pipes. Their strike didn't just change prison policy, it changed perception. For decades, solitary confinement had been accepted as normal, even necessary. Now the world was starting to see it for what it truly was, an experiment in human endurance. After the victory, when the Ashker settlement took effect, many believed Pelican Bay's SHU would fade into history. But freedom wasn't as simple as opening a door. Inmates released from the SHU faced new challenges. After decades in isolation, many couldn't handle the noise, movement and unpredictability of normal prison life. Some became paranoid. Others withdrew completely. Mental health specialists called it SHU syndrome, a psychological imprint left by years of sensory deprivation. One freed inmate described the first night back in general population. "I couldn't sleep. The sound of people talking scared me. I missed the silence I used to hate." The paradox was haunting. They had survived the SHU but part of them never left it. The legacy of the strike. Pelican Bay's hunger strikes became a turning point in the history of American incarceration. They proved that even in the most controlled, most silenced environment imaginable, resistance could still echo through concrete walls. The movement sparked nationwide debates about solitary confinement, influencing reforms in states like Colorado, New York, and New Jersey. The United Nations cited Pelican Bay as a case study in why solitary beyond 15 days should be banned globally. But even today the debate continues. New isolation units still exist under different names: restricted housing, administrative segregation, protective custody. The architecture changes but the logic remains: control through isolation. At Pelican Bay the SHU still stands, quieter now but still there. The walls remember. When the heavy steel doors of the Pelican Bay SHU began to open after decades of protest and legal battles, it felt like the end of an era. But for many of the men stepping back into the general prison population, or into freedom, the real challenge was just beginning. For years the SHU had been their world. 8 by 10 feet of concrete, no sunlight, no voices, no human touch. And when that world suddenly expanded, it didn't feel like liberation. It felt like disorientation. Relearning humanity. When psychologists and researchers met inmates released from the SHU after 10, 15, or even 25 years, they encountered men who had to relearn how to be human. Simple things, eye contact, conversation, physical proximity, had become foreign, even frightening. One former Pelican Bay inmate described his first day back among other people. The noise was too much. Talking, laughing, footsteps, doors clanging. My body tensed like I was being attacked. He hadn't spoken to another human being face to face in over a decade. Even standing in line for food made his pulse race. When someone accidentally brushed against his shoulder, his entire body stiffened with panic. Psychologists called it hypervigilance. Years in isolation rewired the brain's fear centers. Inmates' minds learned that every noise, every movement, every unknown presence could mean danger. What if I told you there's a prison so isolated, so secretive, that even sunlight struggles to find its way inside? A place where silence screams louder than words, and men slowly lose their sense of time and self. This is not a movie. This is Pelican Bay State Prison. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because what you're about to see is one of the darkest corners of the American justice system. When California built Pelican Bay State Prison in 1989, it wasn't meant to rehabilitate. It was meant to contain. Located in Crescent City near the Oregon border, it was designed as a supermax facility, a term that itself carries a chill. This was the end of the line for inmates considered too dangerous, too unpredictable, or too influential for any other prison. Pelican Bay's architects envisioned control, not comfort. They built concrete structures designed to break communication and connection. The cells? 8 feet by 10 feet. No windows. No sunlight. Just thick gray walls, a stainless steel toilet, a sink, and a slab of concrete masquerading as a bed. Inside this fortress, over 1,000 inmates would be housed in the Security Housing Unit, the infamous SHU, pronounced SHU. Here, prisoners are locked in for 22.5 to 24 hours a day. No phone calls. No communal meals. No visits except through thick glass. For many, even human voices become rare. The SHU was meant to stop gang activity, especially from groups like the Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, and Black Guerrilla Family. California's prison officials claimed that isolating gang leaders would weaken their control. But in practice, this isolation did more than silence. It dehumanized. Prisoners inside these cells had no idea what time it was. They learned to count the days by the way light shifted through the cracks under the steel door, or by how often food trays slid through the slot. That slot, barely 6 inches wide, became their only connection to the world. Through it came every meal, every communication, every shred of humanity the system allowed. Even the yard, their time outside, was a concrete pen known as a dog run. No grass. No sky. Just high walls and a metal grate above. The only glimpse of the outside world was a patch of sky the size of a small window. Correctional officers would patrol the corridors with keys jingling and radios buzzing, the sounds echoing like ghosts down the concrete halls. To many inmates, even those noises were a form of company. For the guards, it was another kind of isolation, a job that required emotional distance, routine searches, and the constant risk of violence. Some officers would later admit that Pelican Bay affected them too, mentally and emotionally. The silence, they said, gets inside your head. But the SHU wasn't just a building. It was a philosophy. The state believed that control through isolation could crush the prison gangs. Instead, it began crushing minds. Inmates started reporting hallucinations, voices, shadows, paranoia. Some would write letters describing how they could feel their own sense of reality slipping. One man wrote, "After a while you stop thinking in days or weeks. You start thinking in walls." The system called it management. Psychologists called it torture by design. The first warning signs came early, from court filings, journalists, and human rights observers who began to question how long-term isolation could exist under the Constitution's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. But Pelican Bay was just getting started. For most people, an hour of silence is peaceful. Inside Pelican Bay's Security Housing Unit, silence is punishment, a weapon more effective than chains. A typical day in the SHU is eerily predictable. Every morning, the fluorescent light flickers on. Not sunlight, not dawn, just electricity humming against concrete. There's no sunrise, no birds, no morning routine. Only the hollow clang of metal doors and the faint shuffle of guards' boots echoing down the hallway. At 6:30 a.m., a meal tray slides through the small steel slot in the door. Breakfast. It might be powdered eggs, cold cereal, or a sandwich sealed in plastic. No coffee, no conversation. Just the sound of the tray scraping metal. Inmates rarely see the faces of the people who feed them. The entire exchange happens in silence. A hand through a slot, a tray in, a tray out. Then the hours begin to stretch, long, empty, and indistinguishable. The walls are painted pale gray. The air feels still, heavy, and recycled. Many inmates count the cracks in the wall or recite memories just to keep their minds from collapsing inward. One prisoner described it like being buried alive but awake. They're allowed outside, but only for 90 minutes a day. Outside doesn't mean a yard with grass or sunlight. It's a small concrete pen known as the dog run. Imagine a rectangle of walls with a steel grate overhead. The only sky you'll ever see is through that grate, a small patch of blue that looks more like a memory than freedom. Some inmates use their 90 minutes to do push-ups, jumping jacks, or laps around the narrow space. Others simply stand still, close their eyes, and imagine they're somewhere else, anywhere else. When their time is up, they're escorted back to their cells, hands cuffed behind their backs, ankles shackled. The rest of the day passes in near total silence. There's no talking between cells, or at least not openly. But humans always find a way. Inmates developed a secret code called the tap system. They would tap messages through walls, each series of knocks representing a letter or word. Entire conversations happened this way, unseen but deeply human. Others used fishing. They'd tear strips from their bedsheets, tie them together, and slide them under the door with a small weight attached, often a rolled-up piece of soap or a battery. They'd cast the line toward another cell, sliding messages, food, or even art supplies back and forth. It was dangerous. If caught, punishment followed. But for men who hadn't touched another human being in years, these moments of contact were worth the risk. By 9 p.m. the lights dim, but they never truly go dark. Sleep is uneasy. The hum of the ventilation system, the metallic creak of the pipes, the distant cough of another inmate, they all blend into a constant reminder that you're not alone, yet you are completely isolated. Some inmates sleep with their eyes open, others talk to themselves, and a few scream through the night, their minds breaking under the weight of endless confinement. Psychologists later documented severe symptoms: paranoia, hallucinations, panic attacks, and cognitive decline. For some, even after release, the effects of solitary confinement never faded. They couldn't handle open spaces, social interactions, or silence, because every part of their identity had been reshaped by the box they lived in. The guards see it too. Many officers describe walking the SHU corridors as walking through a morgue, except the bodies are still breathing. One officer once said in an interview, "You can feel the madness in the air. You don't have to see it. You hear it, in the silence." But there's another layer to life in the SHU, gang validation. When they were finally surrounded by people again, their brains couldn't turn that alarm off. Others struggled with what experts called social atrophy, the slow erosion of the ability to connect, empathize, or read human emotion. A few admitted they preferred the silence of the SHU to the chaos of normal prison life. One man told an interviewer from NPR, "It's strange, but I missed my cell. I knew who I was in there. Out here, I don't know anymore." The long shadows of solitary. Studies in the years after the Ashker versus Brown settlement found that the effects of long-term solitary confinement could last for life. Former SHU inmates showed high rates of PTSD, depression, anxiety, and insomnia. Many had lost the ability to trust. Some experienced hallucinations long after leaving isolation, phantom voices calling their name, shadows shifting in the corner of their vision. A few couldn't handle the transition and ended up committing new offenses just to return to custody, not for power but for familiarity. To them, the outside world felt too big. One parole officer in California explained it this way: "You spend 20 years in a box and then one day we hand you a bus ticket and say, 'Go live.' But no one teaches you how to be alive again." Some men found peace through writing. Others joined advocacy groups that spoke publicly about prison reform, turning their trauma into testimony. Former Pelican Bay inmates like Sitawa Nantambujama and Paul Red began speaking at universities and conferences, explaining that isolation doesn't just punish the guilty, it damages the human spirit. A system still in the shadows. Pelican Bay's SHU may have changed, but the system it represented still lingers. California replaced many solitary cells with step-down programs, where inmates could gradually earn more privileges over time. In theory, it was progress. In practice, many said it was still the same isolation, just renamed. Nationally, the U.S. still holds tens of thousands of prisoners in some form of solitary confinement. Some for days, some for years. The labels vary: administrative segregation, protective custody, restricted housing, but the result is the same: silence, loneliness, and slow psychological decay. Advocates argue that solitary confinement does not rehabilitate, it only deepens trauma. Even correctional officers have begun to speak out. Former guards from Pelican Bay have admitted that the SHU took a toll on them too. One said, "We were told we were keeping order. But after a while, I realized we were keeping ghosts. The prison that time forgot." Today, Pelican Bay still stands on California's northern edge, shrouded in coastal fog and pine forests. It remains one of the most secure prisons in America, though the SHU's population has shrunk dramatically since the reforms. But for those who lived inside it, the memories are permanent. The architecture itself tells a story: endless gray corridors, thick steel doors, cameras at every corner. Even the silence seems haunted. Visitors describe a feeling that's hard to put into words. A kind of pressure in the air, like the building remembers every scream that was never heard. And maybe it does. Because places like Pelican Bay aren't just built of concrete, they're built of human suffering, and that suffering leaves marks that never fade. Life beyond the walls. For the few who made it home after years in solitary, Adjusting to society can be even harder than surviving the SHU. Imagine walking into a grocery store after decades alone. Lights, sounds, colors, choices. It's overwhelming. Some men said they'd walk out without buying anything, frozen by the chaos of normal life. One former Pelican Bay inmate described his first night sleeping outside of a prison cell. "I woke up every few minutes waiting for the light to come on, waiting for the sound of keys. When nothing happened, I didn't feel free. I felt lost." Community programs and nonprofits have tried to help with therapy, housing, and job placement, but progress is slow. The trauma of isolation runs deep, deeper than most people can imagine. Yet, among all the pain, there are glimpses of resilience. Some of the men who once lived in the SHU now mentor at-risk youth, teaching them what prison really does to the soul. Others write letters to current inmates, reminding them that they are not forgotten, that even in the darkest cell, there's still a spark of humanity left to protect. The final truth. Pelican Bay began as an experiment in control, a supermax fortress meant to contain violence. But in trying to control the human mind, it revealed something even more powerful: the human spirit's refusal to be erased. The SHU was supposed to break men. Instead, it exposed the moral cracks in the system that built it. It showed that silence can be a form of violence, and that justice without humanity becomes something else entirely. Today, the story of Pelican Bay isn't just about prisoners. It's about all of us. About what happens when a society decides that isolation equals safety, and forgets that punishment without compassion breeds only more darkness. Because behind every concrete wall, behind every steel door, there's still a heartbeat, and a reminder that humanity doesn't end at the cell door. The story of Pelican Bay is not just about crime, punishment, or control. It's about what happens when a system forgets that the people inside its walls are still human. For decades, thousands of men were locked away in silence, stripped of touch, time, and connection, but not of spirit. From those cells came letters, protests, and voices that refused to disappear. Pelican Bay was built to contain violence, yet it became a mirror reflecting something far more uncomfortable: the violence of indifference. And while reforms have changed its policies, the legacy of what happened there continues to echo across America's prisons. If there's one lesson to take away from this story, it's this: isolation doesn't heal. It doesn't reform. It only teaches us how easily we can forget our own humanity when we stop seeing it in others. So as the fog rolls across Crescent City and the gray towers of Pelican Bay fade into the distance, remember, these walls may hold men, but they also hold stories. Stories of suffering, resilience, and survival. Stories that demand to be heard. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep look inside the hidden realities of the prison system. Because the next story might change the way you see justice forever.